Well, good afternoon to you. We're glad to see you here at RPTS today. My name is Barry York, and I'm the professor of pastoral theology, but maybe my role right now is more the dean of faculty, because one of my responsibilities is to encourage my colleagues and to promote them, and I'm very thankful for the men I work with and the good work that they're doing. And of course, you're here today to hear from Dr. Williams, so I'm not going to take too much time, but just to say that Dr. C.J. Williams is our professor of Old Testament studies. He's been here since 2005, so he's in his 12th year, I believe, of teaching, and we're very grateful for him. And those of us who have heard him teach or preach know that he's a very deep well, and so we're very excited that he's put pen to paper, so to speak, and written this first book on the shadow of Christ in the book of Job. And he's going to come up and tell you here in a short presentation of what this book is all about. So, CJ, we welcome you.
Thanks. Thank you. Well, I do certainly appreciate you coming out this afternoon. And this is a good turnout. I expected my mother to be here and maybe one or two students, but I'm delighted to see more of you have taken an interest in this. So let me begin by thanking you for being here. This isn't going to be a long presentation. I'm just going to talk a little bit about a little bit of the background to the book and some of my thoughts on it, and maybe a few points to interest you in reading further. One of the thoughts I had when thinking about this time we'll have this afternoon is how the book of Ecclesiastes talks about many of the cyclical and seemingly never-ending events in this world. And among those, the preacher points out that of the making of many books, there is no end. And so I wondered what the preacher of Ecclesiastes might think if he were here at this event today. He would probably not see it as very noteworthy, but rather just the release of one more book among countless others that are written and printed every year. And I'm also conscious of the fact that it really does remain to be seen what good, if any, it will do in the work of the kingdom. That's something that remains to be seen. But my hope and my prayer for this little book is that some good will come of it for the glory of God and the good of His people. And if at the end of the day, if that much can be said, then it will be well worth it. So that is my one hope. But I want to thank all of you for taking an interest in it, at least enough to come out here today and hear a little bit more about it. Just a little bit of the background of this book. For many years, I've been fascinated by, interested in, drawn to, maybe even in some sense haunted by the book of Job. I've preached through it, I've taught through it several times, I've read it many, many times, and each time through it, I've always come away having learned something. And so it's a book like no other, and it just has always been sort of at the forefront of my mind. And I've always just enjoyed and grown in every opportunity to teach on the book or to preach through it. And so I always, for a long time, had wanted to do some work on this book. Much work has been done on this book. There's voluminous commentary on the book of Job from all ages of church history and myriad perspectives on the book. But again, that's one of its fascinating features, is that it has always seems to have invited and yet defeated every attempt to offer a nice, tidy explanation for what the book is all about. And so that's one of the things that drew me to it. My own perspective on the book has developed over those years, as I mentioned, teaching and preaching through the book, and developing a perspective on really what the book is about in terms of its place in the canon and how it contributes to what the main theme of the Old Testament is, and that is the expectation of Christ and His person and work. How does it fit into that purpose of the Old Testament? I have been working on a full commentary on the book of Job, a verse-by-verse and chapter-by-chapter commentary, which, as you can imagine, is a big kind of project. But it dawned on me, as my view of the book began to develop, it dawned on me that what might be most helpful is to write just a very short, concise, introductory kind of work giving you sort of a big perspective on just what the book of Job is all about in relation to the expectation of Christ. So I decided to do that, and you'll notice this book that is being released is a short book. Right? It's concise, and I wanted it to be that way, that you could sit down in 2 sittings or whatever and read through it and get at least one perspective on how to understand the book as a whole and what its purpose is in the Bible. And the thesis of the book is basically that the key to understanding the book of Job is that we have to look at Job as a type of Christ, and this book as one of many others in the Old Testament that contribute to that ongoing expectation of Him. That is the primary and the key to understanding this book, to see it in the light of Christ and to see Job as a historical prefigurement of that salvific suffering that Christ would undergo for our sakes. And I think its uniqueness lies precisely in the fact that no other Old Testament book testifies to Christ quite like the book of Job does. It is unique in every way. So I think when seen from this view, the purpose and the power of the book of Job just opens up and it comes to life. And that's really what I wanted to capture in this little book. So I approach this thesis in the book incrementally, right? Trying to build that thesis chapter by chapter from different perspectives. What are the different aspects of the book that give a clue to us that Job is supposed to be understood this way? And I approach it from those different perspectives and chapter by chapter building an argument until hopefully at the end of the book the picture is hopefully somewhat complete. And today I just wanted to perhaps delve into a few points in the first few chapters of the book, just to give you sort of a taste of my thinking in the direction of the book. The very first chapter of the book is a very short and concise treatment on typology itself. And what is typology? So I try to put that as succinctly as possible and describe it. What is it? How do we know it when we see it? And to understand that before delving into the case of Job in particular. And basically, typology is God's own method of using people or events or institutions of the Old Testament to prefigure the person and work of Christ specifically, or greater gospel realities. So it's a complement to literary prophecy, where literary prophecy is words proclaimed by a prophet and written on a page. But God's promises were more than that. They touched down in the life and in the experience of God's people, so that His promises were molded onto history, so that there were living illustrations of them throughout Israel's history. That's what typology is, and there are typological figures and events and institutions in the Old Testament that bring the promises of God in the covenant of grace to life in the people's experience. Right? So it's a wonderful method of prophecy, if you will, and that gave the people a greater assurance that God's promises were built into history and were coming to pass. So after describing that, and some of the pitfalls of typology too, there have been abuses in the past where people have resorted to typologizing, which is to make fanciful or creative or intuitive connections between the testaments that aren't necessarily meant to be made. And so the whole idea of typology in some circles has fallen into disrepute because of that. But it is a biblical and historical method of prophecy, and we recognize it from the Scriptures. But we have to be careful. It has to be understood textually, and we have to, there are parameters to it, and it has to be something textually controlled, not something fancifully created. So the first chapter of the book is about that. What is typology, and how do we know it when we see it? I also go into a few of the sort of the big hermeneutical principles of my approach, not only to Job, but the whole Old Testament, and that is that it is meant to be understood as a testament to Christ. That's the purpose of the Hebrew Bible, and Christ said so himself on many different occasions, that it is Moses and the prophets and the Psalms and all of the books of the Old Testament that testify to him. Right? So to read the Old Testament in any other way is to miss its main point according to Christ. So how do we bring that perspective to Job and do it in an honest way? right, in a way that is exegetical and real, and not just fanciful and allegorical. That's what I had hoped to accomplish. A couple other things I want to summarize about the book. In an early chapter of the book, which I call the Messianic trajectory, what I try to do is take the story of Job and try to understand it in its broadest outlines. Try to understand what the process and progress and conclusion of the story, how that fits into our understanding of Scripture. So I begin by pointing out that all of the descriptions of Christ's life and ministry and all the prophetic anticipations of him all follow a certain pattern, which is what I call the Messianic trajectory. And it is that of being cast down from an established position to the depths of undeserved suffering, to be exalted once again by the hand of God to a place of even greater honor than before. Now, this process of suffering leading to glory or tribulation leading to grace, it's used as a summary of Christ's life in so many ways. On the road to Emmaus, right? He talks to his disciples and says, "Ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory?" That sequence. And then he goes through the Scriptures to talk about all of the Scriptures that show him suffering to glory. Peter talks about all the prophets. All of the prophets testify to, quote, "the sufferings of Christ and the glories that would follow." It's always that sequence of suffering leading to glory. Even Paul famously in Philippians talks about how Christ is equal with God and then obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross, and then God gave him the name which is above every name, tracing that trajectory, right? So Christ and the apostles could point to this pattern as the essence of Jesus' ministry. Now, when you go back to the Old Testament, look at the literary prophecies of the Old Testament, it's replete with this pattern, isn't it? Through the Psalms, it's suffering leading to grace, it's tribulation leading to glory. And this is true in the Psalms and in many of the prophecies about the humiliation and the exaltation of Christ. So that's a pattern, that's a literary and prophetic pattern that we also see borne out on the stage of history in the lives of many prominent characters in the Old Testament. Joseph, to name one, David, to name another. These are men who are in an established position, cast down to the depths of undeserved suffering and humiliation, only to be exalted by God again at last. Now, Job, if you think about it, is the clearest example of that pattern, because we see him in the beginning of the book, the greatest man of the East, and God says, there's none like him on earth. He's pious, he's prosperous, there's nobody like him. He's up here. And then he gets cast down to experience the worst humiliation and suffering that any human ever had experienced. And then at the end of the book it says, God blessed the latter days of Job twice as much as the beginning. And whatever he had at the end was double what he had at the beginning. There was a double blessing upon him at the end. So it traces that pattern of being cast down from an established position to undeserved suffering, only to be exalted by God to a status of even higher exaltation at the end. So it fits that pattern. And to understand that pattern gives us sort of a way to approach the book of Job and to understand it as part of that pattern that leads to Christ. So Job is not, part of my thesis is the book of Job is not about the problem of human suffering. The book of Job is not about your suffering and mine. The book of Job is about the suffering of Job. And it is entirely unique and entirely prophetic. And it points us to Jesus Christ and what he suffered in our behalf. So that's one sort of snippet from the book. I'll mention a few others too. And the next is when I start to profile Job, the man himself, and I'm obviously not going to give you the whole book here. I'd like you to read it on your own. But Job is introduced to us in the most unique way in the Scriptures. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that's it. Right? We're not given any indication of the provenance of the book or the background of this man or anything. And one of the chapters of the book I point out is that genealogies are part of the very structure of the Old Testament. They came to be expected and appreciated by the original audience, perhaps in a way that you and I don't appreciate them. The whole Old Testament has a genealogical structure. The entire book of Genesis is a series of genealogies. That's why it's called Genesis. The chronicler, when he wanted to retell the whole story of the Old Testament, starts with 9 chapters of genealogy. So genealogy is important for any character of the Bible because it, in a sense, authenticates them historically, and it gives their life its historical bearing, and so on. For Job to enter into the scene here without any genealogy, without any indication of where he comes from or who he is a very unique thing in the Bible. The only other major precedent is Melchizedek. And Melchizedek comes on the scene without genealogy. He's there for 2 or 3 verses, and he's gone just like that. But is his lack of genealogy an indication of his typological role? The writer of Hebrews certainly thought so. And the writer of Hebrews points to that as prima facie evidence that he was a type of Christ. So the question I ask in this chapter is, does Melchizedek give us a precedence for understanding the introduction of Job? And I think it does. That Job just as mysteriously enters the scene, just like Melchizedek, and goes through in an experience that points us directly to Christ and what he would experience. So I think that is an important, significant aspect of the book. I'll just give you a short snippet from one more chapter, too. And when the book unfolds and you have this almost surreal scene of Satan coming to present himself before God, and God asks him from where he comes what he's been doing. Now, I think that whole interchange between God and Satan is absolutely key to understanding the purpose of the book. Satan comes in among the other angels, and he's there to give an account. Right? God is the sovereign. Satan is reporting to him, right? So there's no question in this book. God's sovereignty over evil is not an abstraction. Satan is accountable to him, and he comes into God's presence to give an account of what he's been doing. God asks him, where are you coming from? God isn't asking out of ignorance. He's calling him into account. The same way he asked Adam in the Garden of Eden, where are you? It's not because he doesn't know. It's because he's calling a subordinate creature to give account of his actions. So when he says that to Job, or when he says that to Satan, where do you come from? What does Satan say? I've been running around the earth going to and fro in it. He brags of his autonomy. He brags of his great liberty to go back and forth through the earth. And how does a sovereign God answer a subordinate rebel? Well, you would imagine he would do it in any other way except to say, have you considered my servant Job? God is the one who turns Satan's attention to Job. Job is to be God's answer to Satan's wanderings of the earth. Whenever Satan makes the assertion of his autonomy, God's answer is, have you considered my servant Job? And Job, what are we going to see in Job? We are going to see an image of a righteous sufferer and then being exalted. A sufferer who suffers grievously, not because of sin, but because God subjected him to that suffering. And then he's going to be exalted at last. That is God's answer to Satan's power and influence. And it is a provisional picture of what God would supply ultimately in Christ. Because Christ is ultimately God's answer to Satan, isn't he? And his suffering and his exaltation is God's answer to that wandering adversary in the world. And so I think that gives us a way to look at Job and his role in this book. Again, I don't want to go on too long, and I plan to only give you a few snippets to raise your interest. But I will mention one more thing. Another chapter in this book that I enjoyed writing, and I hope you'll enjoy reading, is the combination of royal and priestly imagery in the book of Job. Now, we know that Christ is a prophet, a priest, and a king. And all of those offices, which were essential for the maintenance of the covenant under the old covenant, you had prophets and priests and kings, but they all look forward to the perfect one who would fulfill all of those offices perfectly in Christ. And so you have depictions and types of Christ in the Old Testament that combine those offices. Melchizedek is a great example. In fact, there are numerous comparisons between Job and Melchizedek in the book, and this is one of them. Melchizedek is a priest and a king, isn't he? And David is a king, but sometimes we see him in a priestly role, right? He makes sacrifices, something that Saul couldn't do. Saul got in a lot of trouble for that, but David, no. The combination of these offices sometimes give us a glimpse of what is to come. And Job is presented under royal and priestly imagery in the book of Job. I'm not going to delve into the details of that. You might have to read the book to get the full effect of that. But yes, there are sometimes some places in the book where Job describes himself as being like a king who has lost his crown, and that royal kind of imagery, and there's priestly imagery, and I'll make this one more connection for you in terms of priestly imagery. At the beginning of the book, Job makes sacrifices for his children in case they had cursed God in their hearts. At the end of the book, he offers prayers and makes sacrifices for his enemies, his detractors, the ones who had been insulting and challenging him. And God insists, I will only forgive them if my servant Job prays for them. So you have a picture of an intercessory role in Job that grows in its greatness and is refined through suffering. Right? We see him in this intercessory role in the beginning, but I think it's greater. The story of Job, and this is noted by commentators, but often not seen as determinative to the story. Right? Job's intercessory role and how that grows in its greatness through his suffering. And so that is one, certainly a picture that we see. The writer of Hebrews talks about that, how he's perfected by his sufferings, and that he is a mediator who understands our struggles, our needs, and so on. And much of the character of Job, I think, is illumined by the book of Hebrews. And I draw out quite a few of those connections. All right, I'm not going to spill any more of the beans, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of what the book's about. I want to conclude with a few final thoughts here, just maybe 5 more minutes. And I think the seminary has billed this as a book signing. And you know how uncomfortable that makes me. It does to some degree, because signing your name is something that important people do, and I'm not that. I will. Dr. Gamble might sign your book, though, and you know, and it might increase the value of the book. I don't think mine will do that, but his will. His name's on the cover too, so it's worth the. And he wrote a really gracious and nice foreword to the book, so if nothing else, that's worth it. I'm glad to have a colleague with such long coattails that I can just sort of step on, but it is a blessing to have Dr. Gamble read my book, and he did. He read it word for word, offered me wonderful feedback, good constructive criticism that I am deeply thankful for. And so thank you very much. And Dr. Watt also was a big help and also provided an endorsement. So I'm very grateful for that. What was I saying? About the book signing. Writing a book doesn't make you important. A lot of people do it, and there are a lot of bad books today, a lot of good ones. I hope this one turns out to be a good one. That's my hope, my prayer. I hope it has some place in the work of the kingdom. So it's a signature doesn't mean anything in a book like this. But I want to sign it for this reason, and here's the way I look at signing the book. When you have a book, when you print a book, right, it has a nice glossy cover and nice flashy artwork on the front, and you know, you have a known theologian provide an endorsement. You have a publisher provide backing. It's well edited and typeset, and goodness, it's on sale at Amazon, so it has to be true. Everything in it has to be true, right? It has this air of authority, like this person needs to be heard, right? It has that air, whether that air is deserved or not. Right? It has that air. My view of signing the book, and this is the only reason I'll sign a book, is that because that signature is a reminder to you that the author is just an earthen vessel. The author is just flesh and blood, right? And, Scripture is our one authority. And I'm happy to remind any reader of my book that, the author of it is a fallible human being. So that's what the signature will remind you of as the reader. So I think that'll be all. That'll be all the comments I make. And thanks again for coming out. I do appreciate it. And I think I'm going to take some questions now. Is that right?
We did just want to see if there were a few questions that some of you may have that could be of interest to everyone else. So Dr. Williams doesn't think he's that important, and that's okay for him to think that, but we all think he's very important. So if you'd like to ask him questions and learn a little bit more, we'd be glad to entertain those. Any questions? Tim?
I'll ask a question that I asked him earlier, but how does your approach to Job impact your view of the dating of the book?
Yes, okay. Good question. The question is, how does my view of Job impact my view of the date of the book? How ancient it is, when, and what time period? Very good. Modern scholarship tends to date the book maybe slightly before, maybe slightly after the Babylonian exile. Some want to put it as late as, several centuries into the intertestamental period. I think the book of Job, the setting of events of the book of Job, fit best with the patriarchal period. Because if you think about the exercise of Job's faith, how he approached God with sacrifices like the patriarchs did, but there is no mention in the book about Israel or Israel's institutions, and nothing like that, no reference to the Mosaic law whatsoever. But Job's faith meets us with that simple sacrificial worship that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob practiced. So I think it's very likely that the events of the book and Job himself come from that time period, from the patriarchal time period. Now, the book itself, that's harder to say. Maybe the text of it is transmitted over time. It reaches its canonical form at some point later than that. We really don't know. That process itself is kind of shrouded in history to us, that we don't really know. There's no lack of opinions. I was mentioning before that Jewish tradition has it that Moses was the author of the book of Job. We don't have any way to prove or disprove something like that. But I do think it is quite ancient. And Calvin's view of it is very simple but profound. He says we can't fix an exact date to the book of Job. However, we do know that it is very ancient. And he left it at that. And maybe that's the wisest thing to do, is to leave it at that. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
What is the most important thing that you learned while writing the book?
The most important thing I learned about writing a book. It's a lot of work, but if it's something that you really are passionate about and really love, it is a lot of work, but very joyful work. That it is a joy to do. I couldn't imagine writing a book on a topic I wasn't interested in. That would be torture. But if it's something that really, if the book really comes from you and you're writing it because you have ideas and you want to express them, and it's, the book has kind of been there latently inside you for a time and it just comes out, then that's a joy, just trying to put words to ideas on a topic that you love, that you're really captivated by. That's a joy. And that's what I found to be true. Only one per customer? Wait, no, I'm just kidding. One question per customer.
I just heard you were using Melchizedek to compare it to Job.
Yeah.
I remember hearing you say that Melchizedek is pre-incarnated Christ. So
Yeah.
did
Well,
you
that might
change?
be another book for another time. No, I think there is good. I mean, dealing with the treatment of Melchizedek in Hebrews 7, I think there is pretty good footing to see Melchizedek as not only a type of Christ, but a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ himself. I don't think that would change any of the perspectives or any of the connections that I've drawn, between Melchizedek and Job. I don't think it would change that. If anything, it might strengthen maybe that connection of seeing Melchizedek as a precedent for understanding Job. That may well be.
Well, thank you again for coming. And I think what we're going to do at this time is dismiss CJ from this part of the room to the back part of the room. He's going to be present there at the table. We do have his book for sale today at a special discount rate of $8, which is less than half of the retail price. So we encourage you, you can go and see Vicki and purchase a copy if you'd like, and then CJ will be there to sign it for you. If you have any other questions you'd like to ask him, he'd be glad, I'm sure, to entertain those. We want you to enjoy your time here. We have some refreshments over in the periodical room, and so make sure that you take advantage of those. And if any of you are here for the first time at RPTS and want to learn more about either the seminary and what we offer, or even get a little tour, we'd be glad to do that as well. So you could see me, or President O'Neill's here, Mark Sampson, and or Ed Blackwood. Any of us would be glad to serve you that way. Thank you again for coming, and let's show our appreciation to CJ.